In this video, we will be going over how to buy new construction and understand what the steps are, what the things you want to focus on, and a lot of other things that are kind of associated with buying a new construction home. My name is William Singh. I'm a local real estate agent in the Portland, Oregon area. If you have any questions whatsoever, feel free to reach out. I'll make sure to have my contact information below. Now let's dive right into it. So one of the things I want to make clear about this video is that it is going into new construction when the developer is kind of developing a lot. If you're trying to build a custom home that is your floor design and everything, that's going to be a completely separate or fairly different process. So just kind of keep that in mind before diving too much into this video. So one of the things that I do want to go over is the constraints of new builds. One of the things to understand is that if you are in a city, it's usually a lot harder to build in that city because of it's already congested. There's a lot more kind of already there, or the density is a little bit higher. So when it comes to new construction, you're usually going to be able to see it a little bit further out from the city, and is something to be aware of, that you might need to commute a little bit further if you're wanting that. And then also if you're wanting more space, typically they're going to be on the outside of that primary city. So something to keep in mind. And then also there might be time constraints or permitting things that might take things a little bit longer depending on where you're at. One of the things to note for Portland specifically is that we have an urban growth boundary, which means that we can really only build so far out at a time. This usually changes every 10 years or increases every 10 years. So in Portland, you'll see kind of rings of growth, and is one of those things to just kind of keep in mind. Those will continue kind of grow out. Whereas maybe some other cities like Phoenix, or if you're in Texas, you can kind of build very quickly, and you will be able to have less constraints in terms of permitting and things of that nature. So things to just kind of keep in mind. And this is one of those things you can talk to an agent about and kind of understand a little bit more about how long buildings are going to take and what the different constraints might be. So the first part of this is that you will be doing research. Now, this is where you're trying to find the floor plans, really understand what developments are out there, and what the deposit will be, along with kind of timeframes of that nature. So you can also reach out to an agent who can help guide you through that and who understands a lot more about what's kind of going on. So that way they can kind of educate you about the process as well, and what certain developments are doing and what their requirements are. Now, this is one of those things that if you want to go unrepresented, that is completely up to you. Just know that for probably 9 out of the 10 developers you talk to, you're not going to be able to get much of a discount, if any discount whatsoever, if you are not represented. So one of those things that is really up to you to decide whether or not you want to be represented or not. As an agent, of course, I do want buyers to be represented and have the ability to understand a lot more and be guided through the process a bit more. But if you feel like you're comfortable enough not doing that and you're saving money, that's really up to you. During this research, you can also just learn as much as you can about these developments. And one of the things that I can provide is actually a list of questions. If you want to reach out to me, I can kind of provide that list of questions that you would want to be asking those developments to better understand what you're kind of getting into. So part of this research, which might be even like kind of step 2 or 3 at this point, would be to get pre-approved. One of the things to do for this, or the reason for doing this, is so that way you understand what your budget is. A lot of times you're going to be given the base model of these homes, and you need to understand how much you're pre-approved up to, so that way you can be shopping in the at least base model ranges. And then also know that when you're adding any upgrades, that you're going to be paying more for that, and you just need to make sure that it works financially for you. Having a talk with a lender is super helpful. And again, if you need to be connected to a local lender or a local agent, feel free to reach out. I do have a network that spans across the US, so I can certainly help you out to a certain degree. So during this research phase, you are looking up as much information as possible. You might be reaching out to an agent, and you will probably want to get pre-approved to understand what your finances are and things of that nature. We're now going to be diving into the next steps, which can sometimes be changed around depending on who the builder is, what their process is, and sometimes they might not even have one of these steps. So just kind of keep that in mind. And as again, another reason to do your research and make sure you understand what those next steps are, especially with each of these developers. So usually the first thing you're going to do is going to have a first time visit or office visit. Just note that these are typically very long periods of time, so be ready to have some snacks and water so that way you are able to kind of power through this. This is sometimes from 1 hour to 2 hours, and I've seen sometimes up to 3 to 4 hours. So just kind of keep that in mind depending on how much you're going to be packing into this. One of the steps is to look at the model homes and really understand what you're kind of getting into in terms of the floor plan. Usually they'll have a spec home, and a spec home is going to be the home that is a model of sense. That way you can get a better feel for what those rooms are going to be. Just note with these is that they are usually done up very well and they have all the upgrades. So it is something that they upgrade as much as possible so that way it looks as nice as possible, and understand what you're actually getting for the base price and then what those upgrades might be. From, for example, you might have really nice kitchenware or colored cabinets or things of that nature that may not be included in that base level that you have to account for when you are upgrading your home. Another part of this session is to be depositing the earnest money. This is when you are usually writing a check to the builder to say that, hey, we are serious about this and we are wanting to hold this spot. And that's what the earnest money really does. Now, sometimes this is non-refundable, sometimes it is refundable. It just kind of depends on the builder. So again, another question to ask of what are the circumstances for this and what is required for this. One of the other things that the builder will usually do is get you pre-approved. And again, if you've already been pre-approved, this usually isn't a huge deal because you have all the documents and everything ready. Sometimes you can not get pre-approved within the builder, but it's usually just another safeguard for them to say, hey, you actually can afford all this. But sometimes you can also bring in that pre-approval from another lender or the outside lender saying, hey, you are approved for this. So you might have to go through that documentation and just be ready to do that if need be, or it could be something that could be done before that first office visit as well. We've gotten to the purchase contract. This is where you are going to be signing a bunch of documents to formalize this agreement where you've picked out what lot you're doing and then kind of what floor plan you're going to be using. Now, with this, note that a lot of times they are heavily in the builder's favor. So this is something where if the real estate agent can give you some guidance, that is great, but sometimes you may need to have an attorney take a look at this and give you any advice as needed as well, if it's too different from the standard state forms. So once the purchase contract is done, then you're usually moving on to the design meeting. Now, this is where you go over the structural and design elements of this. One thing to note is that when you are adding on things, usually you're going to be paying about 12 to 15% of the base cost of that unit. So just kind of keep that in mind and understand where your budget is and how much you can actually afford. One of the things that you do want to keep in mind is figuring out what you can do versus what the builder can do. So the reason for this is that typically the builder is going to be maybe a little bit more expensive for some things and then less expensive for other things. So for example, putting in new outlets after it has been built is going to be much cheaper to do with the builder versus you. And in the opposite example, putting in a new light fixture is going to be a lot easier for you versus the builder doing it and charging a surplus on the fee of that. So something to just kind of keep in mind when you are going through this process. So the first design or first kind of changes are structural changes. Now, structural changes are when you are changing something into a maybe bedroom, bathroom, you're changing the structure of that room or area. Note that there will be limitations on what you can do with this because they don't try to deviate too much from the initial plan. Now, these are also things where you can start maybe adding a little bit more outlets or things of that nature as well. Sometimes this kind of bleeds into the design aspect. But just know that that's something where you're going to want to have a better understanding of what those things that are going to help on the resale value. And this is really where an agent kind of comes in. It says, hey, this will actually add to the value of your home later on. Another thing that you will be doing is looking more at the design aspect of this. This is where you're going to be picking out the flooring, you're going to be picking out the type of countertops you have, things of that nature. And in general, I usually recommend that you're focusing a lot more on the kitchens and bathrooms. The reason for this is that that's typically where you're going to be getting the most bang for your buck in terms of resale value and just value in general. And another thing to note is if you're going to get carpet in any areas, focus on the padding of the carpet. And the reason for this is that the majority of when you get on a carpet and you say, hey, this is really soft, is primarily from actually the padding underneath. You can always change out the top side of the carpet and then just keep the existing padding there. And just kind of keep in mind that these are things that will kind of help build more value into your home. Now, once you have done all these things and you've selected all your choices, you are then locked in to these design choices up to a certain time frame. Once you have selected everything at this design meeting and you've kind of finalized a lot of your choices, you then usually have a short window where you're able to make any changes as needed. Now, this is one of those things that once this period ends, you will then most likely be incurring any fees or some sort of fees if you decide to change anything after this. So this is one of those things where if you want to make any changes, do them now or during that time period, and make sure you're aware of what that time period is. So now that we've done a lot of legwork in terms of understanding exactly what the developer is doing and doing that first meeting and doing the design meeting, now we are getting to the build portion of this. Now, this will vary greatly depending on where you're at, but you can sometimes see construction being done as soon as maybe 4 to 5 months, up to sometimes 9 months. It depends on how rainy things are, how delayed the supplies are, things of that nature. So just understand that you need to set your expectations, the fact that it will take a longer period of time than you think. Most construction will take longer than you think it will. During the build phase, this is usually when you would have a meeting initially where you talk to the superintendent or someone who's kind of in charge of leading the construction side of things, and they will kind of go through everything and kind of give you an idea of where things are at, things of that nature. And if you want, I would start building a good relationship with them, because if you're going to be checking out that place and like really just checking in on the status of things throughout the time, it's a good idea to build rapport and frankly a good relationship with those people to make sure that you are getting the best product at the end of the day. Usually you'll be able to check more on the property once there is a roof on it, and just for safety concerns, but feel free to always reach out to see if you can set up time to actually visit it on a regular basis, just to kind of see where things are at. And that will allow you to kind of get a better feel of kind of where things are at as well. Once the majority of the structures come up and you have a lot of the plumbing and electrical done, that's really when you're going to be having a meeting, usually, and sometimes you don't, depending on the company, where it's a pre-drywall meeting. This is where you kind of go over and see where everything is, piping and electrical wise. I highly suggest that you take videos or photos of this, so that way if you ever decide to change anything or make any adjustments, you know exactly where those water lines are, so that way you don't punch through a line accidentally. It's always good to just kind of have for documentation, so that way if anything does go wrong, you know exactly where things are at as well. One of the things that I always recommend to my clients is to keep on saving money during this time period. If interest rates rise, it's always good to understand that, hey, your monthly mortgage payment will probably be increasing as well, so you should be saving for that. Or if there's any other random expenses that come up, it's always better to have more cash on hand than not to. So now we're going to be diving into the financing side of this. This is something that typically happens about 60 to 90 days before the estimated construction completion date. This way you have all of your ducks in a row, so that way you can close on time. Now, with this, you usually had the option between the in-house lender and then your own lender outside of that. So always ask for a good faith estimate. This will allow you to have a better understanding of what those costs are going to be and which lender will probably be a better fit for you. For example, sometimes builders will say, hey, you're going to get X amount of credit, but then they tack on X amount for the actual closing costs. So the closing costs actually kind of neutralize each other out. So that way it might be better to use the out of house lender instead of using the in-house lender. Just things to kind of keep in mind and good to look at before choosing who that is. Another thing to note is that you may or may not have interest rates that are increasing or decreasing during that time. So something to keep in mind is that you're going to want to have a lender that you can talk to on a regular basis and kind of walk you through those potential issues. So again, one of those things to keep in mind when you're going through this, so that way you can get a rate lock if need be, or you can have a floating rate lock or things of that nature. Just kind of talk through the options of what is possible. One of the next major steps is getting the certificate of occupancy. This essentially means that the place is able to be lived in, and usually within that week or the following week is when you're going to be closing. So we'll kind of dive into that as the next big step. So now that you've got the certificate of occupancy, now you're kind of getting ready for that final walkthrough. So during this time period, you're able to get an inspector to come out and take a look at the place. You're also going to have an appointment with the builder to kind of walk through all your options and really understand what is something you need to add to the punch list, which a punch list is a list of items that need to get done before the close of the sale. And that's where you're able to really see what that final product is going to be looking like. Something to be aware of is the fact that if the punch list items are pretty small, it might be something that will most likely not stop closing. So just know that you might not be able to not close because of that fact, and it will cost you money if you decide to delay that close potentially, if it's at your fault or things of that nature. So something to just kind of keep in mind, and also another reason to talk to an agent about what your options are and whether or not you can get credits or something else to kind of make up that difference. All right, so we've made it through this entire process and you are so close to getting into that new construction home. Now with this, you're going to be going through closing, which closing is usually signing and then you have the close date. In terms of what that kind of looks like is you're going to have a final signing where you meet at escrow or you'll sign a bunch of docs with a notary, and those then get kind of sent back and forth between escrow. You then have that close date where everything's funded and recorded with the county. Now, at this point, you then own the place. So that's when you can kind of move into your new construction home and start one last step. So you've moved in and everything. The last step is really the punch list. So this is one of those things where I still recommend that you go through, take video of anything or pictures of anything that needs to get done, because there might be small things like screens missing or things of that nature that the builder still needs to do. So make sure to have that list down with the documentation as well. So that way you can kind of go to the builder and make sure that any of these punch list items are done. Along with this, there's typically a builder's warranty. This is a 10-year warranty, and one of those things that usually it has a little bit more staged approach. So after 1 year, you can usually go in and see if there's any like small cracks or settling things, the builder will be able to kind of fix those as well. So just something to keep in mind, that you do have certain deadlines after the fact, and that you do need to be able to give them those updates or ask for those requests by that time frame. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out. I also have a list of questions that are very particular to actually buying new construction and what questions to ask. So you can always reach out and ask for that as well. I'll make sure to leave my contact information below. And if you found any of this content helpful, it would be wonderful if you could like and subscribe. It would mean a lot and help those YouTube algorithms. Thanks so much for watching.